People don't usually betray you all at once. That is one of the first lies we tell ourselves because it makes the story easier to survive. We imagine betrayal as a sharp event, a single fall, a clear scene we can point to later and say, "Duh, that was a moment." But in real life, disrespect almost always arrives earlier than evidence. It enters through tone, through omission, through the quiet rearrangement of what you are allowed to question without being made to feel difficult. By the time the visible truth shows up, the invisible truth has usually been living in the room for months. That was a part that stayed with me more than anything else. Not just that my husband lied, not just that he cheated, but that he taught me, slowly and with perfect calm, to doubt whether I had the right to trust my own perception before I ever had proof. That is a very particular kind of arrogance. It does not simply rely on secrecy. It relies on your decency. It counts on your maturity, your patience, your unwillingness to become suspicious without evidence, and then it uses those qualities as camouflage. My husband kept telling me the late nights were temporary. He said work was demanding. He said the quarter would settle down. He said I was reading too much into exhaustion. And for longer than I like to admit, I let those explanations stand because I thought love required a little humility in the face of uncertainty. What I learned is that humility without boundaries becomes permission in the wrong hands. And once someone starts treating your trust like an appliance they can keep running in the background while they build a second life, the real collapse has already begun. My name is Graham, and when this happened I was 41 years old, married for 9 years, and living in a townhouse just outside Philadelphia with a man I thought I understood better than I actually did. His name was Nathan. He worked in corporate law, specifically mergers and acquisitions, which meant long hours, expensive clients, short tempers disguised as precision, and a professional life built around urgency. I worked in museum development, which sounds more elegant than it felt most days. My job was essentially fundraising, donor management, event planning, and the steady art of convincing wealthy people that legacy was just another word for writing a check before they died. Ours was a marriage that looked, from the outside, like competence. Two men with good careers, decent taste, a polished home, enough emotional literacy to host dinner without making other people uncomfortable. We were one of those couple strangers complimented for seeming solid, which is usually a sign that the visible part of the relationship is functioning well enough to distract everyone from asking what the emotional interior might actually feel like. I don't tell the story as someone who was blind. That would be easier. Blindness is innocent. What I was, more often than not, was reluctant. I had spent most of my adult life trying not to become the kind of person who mistakes anxiety for intuition. I was raised by a mother who believed in dignity and a father who believed in restraint, and somewhere between those two values I learned to distrust any emotional reaction that arrived before hard evidence. That can be wisdom. It can also become vulnerability. My false assumption, and I see it clearly now, was that if I remained fair, deliberate, and calm, the relationship would remain morally anchored to those same values. But relationships do not automatically honor the temperament of the more careful person. Sometimes the careful person just becomes easier to manage. Nathan and I met at a mutual friend's apartment opening in Center City. He was funny in that dry, sharp way lawyers often are when they know they are being washed. I liked his intelligence first, then his steadiness, then later, what I believed was his honesty. He could be difficult, yes, but in those early years I interpreted difficulty as seriousness. He did not seem slippery. He seemed exact. There is a difference, or at least there should be. Looking back, I think I confused emotional control with integrity because both wear similar clothes in the beginning. For most of our marriage, our life made sense on paper. We had routines, shared friends, separate careers but aligned ambitions. We traveled twice a year if work allowed it, split holidays without much family drama, and had the kind of practical intimacy that grows in long relationships. Preferred grocery brands, side-of-the-bed loyalties, recurring jokes, the private language built from repetition. I am not interested in rewriting all that is fake. It wasn't fake. That is part of what made the betrayal worth grieving. Real things existed. They just stopped being equally protected. The first changes were subtle enough that I felt almost embarrassed by them. Nathan became less available in the late evenings, but that could be explained by work. He started coming home with a kind of polished fatigue that felt more curated than exhausted, but again, work could explain that too. He used to torque through his day in fragments, a ridiculous client, a partner behaving like a small king, some associate who had sent an email that practically begged for public execution. Then those stories thinned out. His days started arriving in summaries instead of texture. Long day, nothing interesting. Deal is ugly. On their own, those lines meant nothing. The problem with intelligent betrayal is that almost every individual detail has plausible deniability. The truth only becomes visible once you stop isolating each moment and allow yourself to call the pattern by its real name. Then his tone changed, and that mattered more than the schedule at first. He became easier to irritate around ordinary questions. If I asked what time he thought he'd be home, I might get, "I already told you I have no idea." If I asked whether he still thought we could make a friend's dinner Friday, he would sigh and say, "Do you need everything pinned down in writing?" That kind of contempt is easy to miss if you are still trying to be fair. It doesn't scream. It just turns your ordinary bids for coordination into evidence of some personal failing. I tried to talk to him before the story had hardened. I remember the moment because it was a Thursday night and he was standing in the kitchen eating leftover pasta straight from the pan, still in his shirt sleeves, tie loosened, looking more annoyed to be home than relieved. "You've been real far away lately," I said. He looked at me for maybe half a second and then went back to the pan. "I've been working." "I know that. This feels like more than work." He let out a breath through his nose, not quite a laugh. "You always do this when I'm stretched then." "Do what?" "Turn pressure into some deeper emotional event." That line stayed with me because of what it did. It made my perception the problem, not the behavior provoking it. That is one of the oldest manipulation patterns in intimate life. The person creating distance invites you to defend the legitimacy of noticing it. Once you're doing that, you've already surrendered ground. I let the conversation die there. That was one of my mistakes. Not because I should have accused him without evidence, but because I should have respected my own discomfort more than I respected his irritation. Fairness is valuable, but fairness extended indefinitely towards someone who is already distorting reality becomes self-betrayal dressed up as maturity. The first name I later realized mattered was Julian. At first, he was just a colleague, then a client-facing strategist on a large deal, then someone Nathan mentioned offering enough to normalize but not enough to make fully real. Julian thought the timeline was unrealistic. Julian was better with European Council. Julian had a ridiculous taste in shoes. Julian was still in the office when Nathan left. The repetition itself mattered. The vagueness mattered even more. Hidden people are often introduced in exactly that amount of detail, enough to keep them from seeming concealed, not enough to let them settle into harmlessness. One evening, about 3 weeks before our anniversary, I was reaching for the charger on Nathan's side of the bed when his phone lit up on the nightstand. I wasn't snooping. I saw the preview because it arrived where my eyes already were. "Thanks again for tonight. You looked good when you were lying." My body went cold before my mind formed anything useful around it. When he came out of the bathroom, I asked calmly, "Who's Julian?" He was drying his hands when I asked. He belly paused. The person texting you that you look good while lying." He gave me a look I came to hate later because of how elegantly it blended insult and disappointment. "That's from Julia. Your phone says Julian." "No, it doesn't." "It did." He picked up the phone, scanned the message, then smiled the way people smile when they have already decided you're being unreasonable. It auto-corrected the contact display from work. "That's not even remotely what you think it is." "What is it?" He shrugged. "A joke about a client dinner." Julia said I sounded more enthusiastic in the room than I was. "That's a strange joke." "No," he said, setting the phone face down. "You're making it strange." There it was again. Not the answer. The reframing. The implication that my interpretation was a breach. I said nothing after that because I understood, dimly at first, that emotional speed only helps the liar when they are better prepared for the scene than you are. Nathan wanted me reactive. He was calmer inside dishonesty than I was inside suspicion. That imbalance matters. The person who already knows the truth always has an advantage in the first confrontation unless you are disciplined enough not to give them one. For about 10 days after that, he got softer, more attentive, more available. He asked about my upcoming donor dinner, touched my back while passing through the kitchen, suggested we take a weekend away after this insane stretch ended. Years earlier, that would have comforted me. By then, it felt timed. Sudden tenderness after suspicion is not always intimacy. Sometimes it is system maintenance. The betrayer is not reconnecting, he is checking whether influence still works. The actual discovery came through a receipt. That is the banal cruelty of adult betrayal. For all the emotional complexity people use to defend their behavior, the truth often arrives through something as ordinary as paper. Our anniversary was on a Sunday in October. Nathan had told me the week before that he'd be tied up with a closing and wanted to do something nice later in the month instead. I was disappointed but not surprised. Work had colonized many parts of our marriage by then, or at least that was the explanation I was still trying to honor. The Friday before our anniversary, I was cleaning out the hallway drawer where we dumped unopened mail, old batteries, receipts, and the other small debris of organized domestic life. Tucked between 2 dry cleaning slips and a parking stub was a receipt from a jeweler in Rittenhouse. The date was 2 days earlier. The amount was just over $1,900. I stared at it for a long time because I knew, with a kind of cold certainty that leaves no room for polite interpretation, that it was not for me. Nathan and I did not exchange surprise fine jewelry gifts. That was not our style, not financially and not emotionally. If he had bought something that expensive for our anniversary, I would already have known it existed because we had always discussed purchases of that size, even gifts. Still, the receipt by itself was not enough to collapse a marriage. It was enough to justify no longer protecting his version of reality. That night, after he fell asleep, I checked his email from the shared tablet we both sometimes used for travel itineraries and restaurant reservations. There was the invoice. Not under my name. Under J. Mercer. There were also hotel confirmations in the trash. A boutique hotel downtown, day-use suite reservation. Another at a place in Washington the weekend he told me he was staying late at the office to handle closing documents. There were calendar invites with vague labels that matched the receipts. And finally, there was the thread. Archived under a woman's name. Julian. The messages were not romantic in the adolescent sense. That almost would have been easier. They were adult, logistical, and ugly in a way that revealed not just appetite but confidence. Taunting, rooms, private jokes, complaints about the domestic script. One line from Julian said, "Do you really still believes all this is temporary?" Nathan replied, "He believes what fits the life he wants to preserve." That sentence did more damage than the sexual content ever could have, because it told me the affair was no longer just a moral failure. It was a philosophy. He had built a whole explanation of my character in which my patience, my caution, and my desire not to turn uncertainty into chaos had become tools he could rely on. I copied everything: screenshots, confirmations, invoice numbers, dates. Then I went downstairs and sat in the dark living room until sunrise. Not crying, not shaking, just thinking. Betrayal does not always make a person emotional first. Sometimes it makes him exact. That was what happened to me. The story simplified. The parts I had been trying to hold separately clicked into one structure. The softened tone after suspicion, the late nights, the sharpened answers, the message, the missing anniversary, the gift receipt. The affair had not suddenly happened. It had been built in layers, each protected by my reluctance to become difficult. The next morning I met with a lawyer. Her name was Rebecca Sloan. She was practical and sentimental and clear in the way I desperately needed someone to be. After I laid out the facts, she asked, "Do you want to try to save this marriage?" "No." "Do you want to confront him now?" "No." "What do you want?" I answered without hesitation. "I want to stop living inside his explanation of me." That became the principle the next few weeks. I gathered documents, copied financial records, quietly separated what needed separating, opened an individual account, arranged temporary housing with a friend who was between tenants and happy to let me use a furnished apartment above his garage. I did not do any of this in a frenzy. That matters. We live in a culture that mistakes emotional spectacle for seriousness. But some of the most serious decisions are made calmly because the person making them has already passed through panic in private and is now left with structure. Meanwhile, Nathan became more openly impatient. That is another detail I think matters. Once a betrayer believes his story is holding, he often grows more casual with contempt. He thinks the uncertainty has been managed, so he no longer spends the same effort disguising the emotional reality underneath it. One night, while knotting a tie before another temporary late dinner, he looked at me standing in the doorway and said, "You know what your problem is?" I said nothing. "You act like patience is some moral achievement. It's just fear with better branding." That line almost would have broken me if I had still been seeking him emotionally. Instead, it clarified everything. He needed to think that. He needed my decency to be weakness, because if it remained decency, then what he had done would look smaller and meaner by comparison. I said, very calmly, "That's one way to comfort yourself." He laughed, but there was tension under it. "You're not doing any work, Graham." I remember that moment because my overnight bag was already packed in the trunk of my car. He had not noticed the emotional departure because he was still reading visible routine as loyalty. That is where arrogant people often fail. They believe they are still speaking to the same version of you long after that version has already gone. I chose to let the truth come out in the office, not at home. That decision was not about humiliation. It was about context. The affair had distorted work as much as marriage. Nathan had used business travel, billing, narratives, and office hours as cover. Julian was not just a lover. He was part of the same professional ecosystem. I wanted the truth to arrive where the structure had been used. 3 days before the anniversary weekend Nathan had postponed, the firm hosted a client reception at our office. I attended because spouses were invited and because by then I understood that silence is most powerful when it is timed, not when it is endless. Nathan assumed I was coming as part of the usual social script. He had no idea I had already moved half my essentials out. The room was full. Clients, partners, assistants, spouses, people carrying little glasses and polished smiles. Julian was there. Of course he was. He stood beside Nathan near the windows, laughing at something no one else had earned the right to hear. I did not rush toward them. I didn't need to. Rage would have given them a cleaner story than the truth deserved. When the managing partner thanked everyone for coming and invited the team to acknowledge the extraordinary effort behind a difficult quarter, I stepped forward slightly and said, loud enough to be heard but not to echo, "Before we celebrate effort, Nathan should probably explain why our anniversary gift receipt was made out to Julian." Silence took the room. Not chaos, not gasps, just that instant professional stillness that tells you every person present understands something irreversible has entered the air. Nathan turned toward me so fast he looked younger for a second. Not more innocent, more exposed. "What are you doing?" he asked. Again that question. Not what are you talking about. What are you doing? The same reflex every manipulative person has when the hidden structure is threatened. The moral problem to them is still the destruction. I took the folded copies from my jacket pocket and placed them on the nearest table. Hotel confirmations. The jeweler invoice. The archive messages. Enough, not excessive. Julian went pale in a way I suspect he had not experienced often in life. The managing partner, to his credit, said nothing at first. He simply read. Nathan tried the usual path. Privacy, misunderstanding, complexity, the difficult period in the marriage. Emotional confusion. Language meant to widen the scene enough that accountability could get lost inside it. I let him talk for maybe 30 seconds. Then I said, you can call it confusion if you want, but confusion doesn't reserve day suites, buy anniversary gifts for another man, and tell him your husband only believes what suits the life he wants to preserve. That ended the performance. Not because I won, because the truth had finally become more visible than his tone. The firm placed him on leave within a week. He and Julian both resigned before any formal internal review was completed. I moved the rest of my things out the same night as the reception. The divorce took months. The marriage had taken longer to die than either of us admitted, but once the truth stopped needing his cooperation to exist, the administrative part was just sequence. What stayed with me afterward was not rage, not even grief in the romantic sense. What stayed with me was a colder understanding of power. Nathan had not simply cheated because he was unhappy. Plenty of unhappy people do not become strategic liars. He cheated because he believed my emotional restraint made me structurally safe to betray. He thought I was too invested in order, in appearances, in maturity, to ever force the truth into daylight. That assumption was a real power imbalance between us. The affair lived inside it. I also had to look at my own role in the dynamic. Not blame. Role. I had spent years priding myself on being the calm one, the fair one, the one who did not make accusations lightly. That trait is valuable, but without boundaries, valuable traits become resources for other people's selfishness. Nathan did not create that alone. I helped by staying too long inside the identity of the reasonable husband, as though reasonableness itself would protect me from being used. About 10 months later, I saw him once at a cafe in Washington while I was there for a donor trip. He looked composed, older around the eyes, more expensive somehow, which often happens to men who are trying to preserve the image of themselves they have not fully earned anymore. He asked if we could talk. I said, we can stand here for a minute. He told me he was sorry, that he had been unhappy, that he had been arrogant, that he had mistaken my steadiness for consent. That last part interested me because it was the first truly accurate sentence I had heard from him in a long time. I said, yes, you did. He asked if I hated him. No, I said. I just dress silence differently now. That was the truth. So if there is a message in this story, it is not that quiet people always win, or that evidence eventually saves everyone, or that betrayal automatically makes a person wiser. Life is less tidy than that. The message is simpler. Never let someone teach you that your calm is proof they can keep rearranging reality around you. Patience is not permission. Maturity is not surrender. Silence is not always fear. Sometimes it is the place where a person gathers enough clarity to stop arguing with what he already knows. My husband said the late nights were temporary. What he did not understand was that once the truth became visible, his access to my patience was the most temporary thing in the room.